Tens of thousands of these workers are brought across the border from Mexico every year. They are given a quickie physical examination at El Centro, then sent to work on big farms in the Imperial Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, the Salinas Valley, the Santa Clara Valley. They work mostly for big farmers who call themselves growers, although they personally grow and harvest only profits. Before World War II, most of the workers in California's fields were domestic agricultural laborers, following the crops every year. During the war, a farm labor shortage developed. Mexican workers were brought in to meet the emergency. Then the war ended. The emergency was over, but the employers knew a good thing when they saw one. They decided to keep on importing braceros from Mexico under agreements between the U.S. and Mexican governments. Now they prefer Mexican nationals to domestic labor.
Usually, when we think of the produce in our home, we think of farmers on green local pastures who devote their lives to growing the food that supports our economy. In reality, much of what we find in the kitchen is from the mega agricultural community of California. We are also too quick to forget that the backbone of this economy was created by the work of Mexican and Filipino farm workers. This economy was started with the mass immigration of Mexicans to California, searching for work and money in the late 50s. The Promised Land, as they had called it, was supposed to be a starting point for workers in Mexico so they could get the money to support their families. But this so-called Promised Land was very different from what they had imagined. Grape pickers in 1965 were making an average of 90 cents per hour plus 10 cents for basket they picked. This forced workers to push themselves way too hard so they could pick more fruit and earn more money. State laws regarding working standards were simply ignored by growers. Pesticide poisoning was linked to many of the deaths of workers. Sometimes, growers would even spray pesticides on workers as punishment. Farm workers, additionally, had to pay for their own water. At one farm, a grower forced workers to drink from the same cup and priced each drink at 25 cents. No ranches had portable field toilets. Workers' temporary housing was strictly segregated by race, which only deepened the divides between Mexican and Filipino workers. They had to pay $2 or more per day for unheated metal shacks, often infested with mosquitoes, with no indoor plumbing or cooking facilities. Not to mention, these workers never had a stable home and were always moving from one county to another because of different seasons for produce. This denied them the ability to apply for food banks. What they had gotten was a non-starter. It was practically only a small step down from slavery, and most had realized that they were worse off than when they immigrated. This had to change. That's when brave civil rights activists stepped in. People were tired of the mistreatment of their people, and as a repayment for what they did for the nation, they believed they deserved dignity and rights. Long before the UFW was formed, Filipino farm workers stood up against the greed of growers and created a movement. Larry Leong led this movement and continued the efforts of Ernesto Galarza to form a farm workers union in California. He would do anything to try to help the people around him. However, his more militant tactics and confrontational views often made it difficult for agreements to be made with growers. He was also hesitant to work alongside with Mexican activists. Much of this was due to the language barrier and the cultural divide that was created by growers who segregated them. The documentary Delano Manags, Forgotten Heroes of the UFW, well articulates Larry Leong's passion and drive for his people.
For anybody.
I'm going to be very frank with you. I have all kinds of guts, you know. I'm not scared of nobody. And I'm a son of, in terms of fighting for the rights of Filipinos in this country.
Echemos abajo la estación de tren, echemos abajo la estación de tren, echemos abajo la estación de tren.
The Filipino workers led a lot of strikes, by the way, in the Salinas area, and in Santa Maria, and in Stockton. They were known to be militant.
They were old school. They were confrontational. You've got incidences where growers are getting shot at, where scab workers are getting beat up, vehicles being destroyed, barns being burned down.
The workers got their increase that they demanded. The problem was that they didn't sign any contract.
That was precisely the problem for Lariat Leung's movement. Although the violent strikes were successful to increase wages and cause intimidation, they didn't have a profound enough effect on the growers' profits to make them concede to a union. Cesar Chavez and his partner, Dolores Huerta, were determined to change this. Cesar was born to a poor family of farm workers and rose through the ranks of a grassroots community organization called the CSO. Dolores Huerta was inspired by her mom to take leadership roles as a woman. When the CSO refused to concentrate efforts on organizing farm worker strikes, he was inspired to found his own organization called the National Farm Workers Association, or the NFWA for short. Cesar was a charismatic leader and inspired protesters with his vivid speeches. At the time, the National Farm Workers Association had no support at all, and he had to go from county to county, sharing his story and what he was fighting for to gain followers. Little did he know that this would be the stepping stone to one of the most impactful unions and movements in history. Lariat Leung led the biggest workers' strike yet in 1965 at the Coachella grape fields, where workers demanded an increase in wages to $1.25 an hour. Well-organized strikes against grapes were an effective tactic since the grapes grown in California were such a large part of the global market and only had a limited time where they were ripe. But still, the AWOC's efforts were only able to increase wages, and no unions were formed. This was around the time where Lariat Leung noticed that they needed help. Delano was when it all started, the moment when Filipinos and Chicanos worked together to form something bigger than just a strike. The AWOC started the strike, but soon realized that they didn't have the funds nor the support they needed to take down companies like Shinley and DiGiorgio. That's when they joined forces with the National Farm Workers Association. They created unity claps and chants so they could break language barriers. They chanted the phrase, "Si se puede," that was coined by Dolores Huerta and later even used by Barack Obama in a speech. They came together by sharing their music, food, and culture. Despite growers' attempts to put Mexican and Filipino activists against each other, they still came together. They finally unified, which scared large corporations and growers, and Shinley was the first to break. They sprayed strikers with pesticides and caused outrage amongst the people of the NFWA that sparked a march to the capital. Mexicans and Filipinos together marched 340 miles in 25 days and gained support along the way. Their numbers kept growing, and they gained national attention, which inspired many to boycott unjust corporations like Shinley. When they arrived at Sacramento, they had gained 10,000 marchers and flooded the streets. In front of this crowd, Chavez proudly announced that they had successfully agreed to the first major California agricultural union. This would provide workers with a health clinic and health plan, credit union, community center, and cooperative gas station, as well as higher wages for years to come. Growers were astonished when small wage compensations would no longer work, and they needed to make union contracts. To strikers, compensation only meant their efforts were working. There was finally a breakthrough, and soon the AWOC and the NFW realized that they had to join forces to form the UFW. The UFW was the embodiment of the dreams and aspirations of brave activists who wanted a union that fought for the rights and dignity of migrant farm workers. The leaders Lariat Leung, Cesar Chavez, and Dolores Huerta left a long-lasting legacy in history. In many ways, Dolores Huerta worked in the shadows and wouldn't take the credit for her work as much as her counterpart Caesar. But her work and charisma was still very much appreciated and remembered in history. She regrets that she spoke publicly less than Cesar Chavez and hopes to inspire other women for leadership roles in social justice, as shown by the Dolores Huerta Foundation that inspires and organizes communities to build volunteer organizations. Even at 91 years old, she still fights for the rights of people in this country, and she will carry a legacy of strength and compassion. Cesar Chavez has a legacy that shows that anyone determined enough can bring people together to fight for a cause. His leadership and wisdom was able to inspire 17 million people to boycott non-unionized grapes. He was able to lead a movement that made and will make lives of millions of farm workers better. Finally, Larry Itliong will be remembered as the godfather of the movement. He was able to work with people that had different views to accomplish a main goal. He showed his passion and motivation to help his people, and thanks to him, people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were brave enough to do what they did.